Welcome back. I'm Yuval Levin of the American Enterprise Institute, and I do want to just thank you very much, all of you, for being here. I know it's quite a ways to go for a lot of people who are here, and one of the best things about these gatherings for all of us is just being together and getting a sense of the kind of community of people who are thinking about these questions together. We're enormously grateful for it. I also do, getting started, just want to say a word of thanks to my colleagues, the Stories, Jenna and Ben, for getting this together, for really building this community over the last few years and showing extraordinary leadership. And I do just want to give them a hand for the work they're doing. We get to bat cleanup in this session, and there is some cleanup to do, I think, and it is in some ways related to the technical subject of the session, which is also convenient, because I think a lot of the questions that have been, in some respects, opened up and maybe left open have to do really with the fit between the university and civics education. There are certainly questions to think through about what civics is. There are questions to think through about the nature of the modern university. But I think over and over, we've been confronting a set of questions about whether and how this project of civics education in 21st century America fits in higher education, and what it means to think about it in the context of the modern university and all that it is. We're going to do that through a conversation between really two ideal people to think through these questions for us and with us. And so we're very grateful to have them here in this final session. I'm just going to introduce them. They'll each speak for a bit, and then we'll enter into a conversation. We're going to start with Peter Levine. Peter is really, for a lot of us, when you think about civics and higher education, you think of Peter Levine, and that's been the case for decades.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's only halfway how I mean it, but yeah.
I resign.
Peter's at Tufts. He is the Lincoln Filene Professor of Citizenship and Public Affairs at the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. And he teaches political science and philosophy there. He's spent really his entire career engaged in a variety of efforts to bring scholarly work to bear on ways of strengthening American civic life, working on voting rights, on public deliberation, but really more than anything on civics education, and helping us to think about the various ways that it could be part of what higher ed means. He's the author of many books, including most recently, What Should We Do? A Theory of Civic Life, published in 2022 by Oxford, and really a book well worth your while. And Justin Dyer is the inaugural dean of UT Austin's School of Civic Leadership, and a professor of government there. That's, of course, one of these new civic schools that have popped up in public universities in a number of states. And so this question of how civics fits into the life of a university is for him a very practical question, a day-to-day question. He was previously a professor of political science at the University of Missouri. He's also the author of many books on a variety of questions related to our subject, the place of natural law thinking in the American political tradition, and many other questions that have to do with the ways in which the kinds of questions we think about in higher education bear on our civic life. Both of them lately have been thinking and writing a lot about this question of fit in various ways, and I think from rather different angles, which should make for a number of useful ways into this conversation. And so we'll begin. Peter, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the very generous introduction. I was thinking when we were all young and naive and hopeful, by which I mean 9 o'clock this morning, Ben Story gave a lovely introduction to the day, and at one point said there's a case that could be made for a new discipline of civic thought, or civic studies is what I'm going to call it. And he looked over at me, and I think you used my name, which was very nice of you, and I gave you the thumbs up because I know my job, which is to make that case for consideration. And I'm not going to talk as much or at all about the tactical. I thought Jed Atkins did a nice job of differentiating between the tactics of whether it's a good idea to create a new department versus the substance. I'm going to talk about the substance. So, and I do have some slides. I'm sorry, we changed the order, so I'm up with the slides. Oh, I have to click to, oh, there you go. All right, so civic studies I'll talk about it in two ways. It is a tangible program at Tufts University, a very small research university, but that gives you something to think about concretely, to imagine it. It's also a nascent and not very big, but meaningful intellectual movement that is very international, with only some offshoots in the US. And I want to sort of introduce you to that. Some of people in the room know it, but not everybody, or most people won't know about it. And this is one way to describe it. So it is intended to, it's a reform movement, so it's identifying a problem, and the problem is a kind of gap where the other disciplines in the humanities and social sciences are not doing what we need. And the diagnosis is that the other disciplines are doing good, important things, but not what we need. So the social sciences primarily are asking, why do people act in the ways that they do, in a kind of generalized sense? And how might we change their behavior, or how might their behavior change if things about their world change? Like, why are all those people in the subway? That's what the social sciences, I'm going to very boldly just say all this stuff, and you can disagree, but I'm just going to plow through all my simplifying claims. So the social sciences are about human behavior, why people behave the way they do. The humanities are much more about meaning, about what is meant by, not necessarily what is intended, but what's meant by the products of human minds. Those are all good questions. Philosophy is often asking, I'm just showing it my friend Erin Kelly, who's a really good philosopher at Tufts, what is right, what is good, what is fair, or another way to put it is, how should things be? Right? The primary question in political philosophy is often, how should things be? Good questions. All these are good questions. Ethics is often focused around either the life where the unit of the analysis is a human life, so what makes a person good, or what should I do in a particular situation? Should I lie to the Secret Service, to the secret police at my door? Those kinds of questions. Public policy often ends up being the question of what should be done, and that can translate into really the question of what the government should do, including that it should do less. So certainly libertarian or skeptical position towards government is included in public policy, but it's about what government should or shouldn't do. So the claim here is that all those are good questions, you should study them, students should study them, but they miss the citizens question. So this is the citizens question. It's only 4 words long. The question is, what should we do? And all of those 4 words really count, so I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about each one in turn. So the question is, what should we do? Because the point is to act in the world. Not necessarily to change it. Conserving the world, the good things about the world is also action. Sometimes choosing not to act is the right thing, but the ultimate purpose of a citizen in the civic community is to act, or to intentionally refrain from acting. And there's also a kind of discipline, an intellectual discipline, involved in asking, what should we do, as opposed to what's going on. Right? Asking what should we do is hard, actually, intellectually hard. The question is, what should we do? And this is really crucial because the we has a great tendency to slip away. Right? It slips away in different directions. It slips away to what should be done by somebody else. It slips away into the abstract, or it slips into the completely personal, what should I do? But the what should we do is a hard question. It arises at all scales. So it arises for the very concrete group, but it also arises at the scale even of the human species. But I'm interested in the we where there's an actual we. Like, for example, the people in this room, what should we do? If we took that seriously, we would have to do things like figure out how to organize ourselves to make decisions. We would have to figure out how to have a listserv afterwards where we could talk. Otherwise, this isn't really a we. The question is, what should we do? Because it is, as we'd say in academia, normative. It's about what's right or wrong. It's not what you want. And it's not how things are, and it's not what your interests are, it's what should we do. And that's tough because, as we all know, you can't just look that up, and questions of should are disputed, but serious citizens, even if they are relativists in some abstract way, they'll say, but there's no right or wrong answer to moral questions. When they get into an actual decision-making forum, become very convinced that the thing that they believe in is right and can give reasons for it. So citizens use the language of should and should do so. And then I know this is a bit of a stretch, but this is the word what is my hook for saying that facts matter, information matters. in order to decide what we should do, you have to know what's going on, how much things cost, what the probability of success would be. In some ways, should is the hook for the humanities, and what is the hook for the social sciences, although, and even the natural sciences, although they both, that distinction blurs. Quick sort of defense here, because if you think about this long enough, someone sooner or later is going to say, but why do we always have to think about what should we do? What if somebody else has got their boot on the back of our neck? What if somebody else caused the problem? What if somebody else has the resources to solve the problem? And I think my basic answers are twofold. One, even if the other people have caused the problem, they're not going to change unless somebody tries to compel them to change, and trying to compel somebody else to change, or at least to make a request or a demand, is in fact a form of doing. But also because there's something, not just something, but there's much that's intrinsically and deeply rewarding about asking the question, what should we do, no matter how you're situated. So it's not just a means to an end of a better world, it's also a way of living a better life, is to be part of communities that can ask, what should we do? Now, if you start with the question of what should we do, you find it embedded and connected to a lot of other questions. So, for example, who am I is inescapable, because in coming into some kind of community, you do come as a person, however you define that. Person is a slippery concept, but you come in as someone. And also the groups that you're in help to constitute who you are. So you end up thinking about who I am in order to think about what should we do. And also which groups do I belong to, which is not just a simple factual matter, it can be quite a complex matter. You can be complicit member of a group that you don't admit you're part of. You can also think you're part of a group, but nobody pays any attention to you there and they don't like you and you're not really part of the group. So what groups are you in is an ongoing question. And those three questions connect, and I think they're perennial. But if we focus on the moment of what should we do as the civic moment, right, as the constitutive civic moment, I think it leads to three large categories of questions or topics. Well, let me say a group that's actually trying to decide what to do, in fact, is going to think about the immediate problems in front of them. You know, taxes are too high, or souls need to be saved, or police need to stop discriminating. That's what they're going to talk about. But there's another layer of problems which are perennial and intrinsic to being in a group. So one set of questions is, how do you actually create a group that functions so that it can do anything? So again, there would be quite a challenge of turning this community or network of people into a group, and that would involve probably doing things like choosing some leaders, creating a budget, getting a stream of money. And those are a set of questions. And they're not easy, and you don't learn them automatically as a developing human being. You have to learn them. And to break that down, I actually have a much more complex version of this diagram, but a simple one would be that you have to think through the kind of rules and norms that will work to make any kind of group function, and that's very differentiated. It depends on the group. And you have to think about how to create the human connections. I'll say trust as shorthand for the various positive affective relationships that are necessary to make a group work. So that's the first category. The second category is, if we have a good group, and if it's a diverse group, and diversity is valuable, we're going to disagree about means and about ends. And people today have been terribly polite, but have disagreed about means and ends. So how do we deal with that? One set of questions that follows then is, what are the ethics or the personal, also skills involved at the individual level of talking and listening with other people? So what is an appropriate kind of thing to say, and in what way? We might use a word like civility, but what is civility and how to define it? But then also, how do we organize institutions for discourse? A university is one, but a social network is another. US Congress another, a court is another, a newspaper is another. How do we organize and structure institutions for discourse? The third category is, so we're a group, but there are these other people who are not in our group and they don't want to be. For example, this is a group pretty much devoted to civic education in higher ed, which has been talking all day about the others who don't like what we do. So how do we deal with them? And any group always has another. And so in terms of curriculum, I tend to think about the study, critical certainly, but also appreciative of social movements, broadly defined as those things that organize to make change against opposition, and especially of the nonviolent strains in social movements. Not because I'm a pacifist, I'm not. I'm supportive of military action in a number of cases, but because nonviolence is, one, obligatory in cases where you're in a functioning civil society with your fellow citizens. And two, because the nonviolent tradition, people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, gives us deep resources for thinking about all of the topics here. So when we talk about the question from the earlier panel about what would you emphasize, I would, the American Civil Rights Movement would be at the very top of my list because of, among other things, because the nonviolence allows you to act with the resources that you have as a human being, not with things that you're given, such as guns. A few more thoughts. At Tufts, we have a major, 89 majors. We're the smallest Research One university in the United States, so that's a pretty significant number of majors. About 90 professors have cycled in and out of teaching our courses. We have some minors, one of which connects to business and entrepreneurship. We have a prison program, as a number of universities do, so a number of incarcerated students in the Massachusetts correction system are studying for BAs, and they are all majors in civic studies, and those who have graduated and left prisons have done amazing things. So that's, I think this might be my last slide, so I'm almost done. There's more to be said about the Tufts program if you want to hear about it. I'm also inviting you to join civic studies as an international movement of, again, not huge, not tremendously widespread in the United States, but meaningful with activity and opportunity. So we have offered I should have counted, but scores, at least dozens of intensive 2-week-long institutes of civic studies not for college students, but for people like Tamara and many others, for professors and civil society leaders. And those have been in a number of countries. So I'm showing you a picture of Trinity National University in Ukraine, where we did those for 5 years. And a lot of the thinking about this is coming out of other countries and in interactions with civil society leaders. There's a journal of civic studies. It's the Good Society. It's a pretty good journal. It's actually now in its 60-something volume. Various programs around have popped up that are using the Tufts model quite explicitly. So this is McMaster in Canada, where they have a new college, not obviously represented in this room partly because it's Canadian, but they actually took civic studies pretty explicitly. There's a lot of other talking about infiltrating other disciplines. For those of you who are members of the American Political Science Association, there's a civic studies group, and it's free to join if you're a member of APSA, so please join. And so that activity is underway. And yes, I think that's it. So I'm just hoping that will be a kind of provocation. I also think it's going to stand in really interesting, I'm not going to steal your thunder, but I think it's going to stand in really interesting contrast with Justin. And that's good, because the contrast will give you something to think about. Thanks.
When I was an undergraduate student, I took a class at the University of Oklahoma called Foundations of American Politics. And I didn't really know what I was going to study or do. I had some idea that I would go to law school and was a business major at the time. And when I took that class, we read political sermons and pamphlets of the founding era, read the Constitution, read James Madison's notes on the Constitution, read the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, some of Tocqueville, and closed with the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And I loved it. And I thought that's what political science was. And so I changed my major. I said, sign me up. And as Peter was talking, I was thinking about that. It actually introduced me to a lot of the questions that he was outlining about civic studies. But I was introduced to it through these texts. We're thinking about, who are we? And who are we in a community with? Who's included and who's excluded? And how do we debate about principles and what's right and what's just? And how do we live together as a community? How do we constitute a new commonwealth? All of those questions were present there, and it was my introduction to them. I'm grateful for having had that introduction. I think whatever I would have gone on to do with life, that would have been a valuable thing for me to study. And I would not have been exposed to it had I not enrolled in that class. And it was really just by accident that I did that. One of the thinkers that I was also introduced to in that class was James Wilson, one of the forgotten American founders. Wilson studied law under John Dickinson. He wrote one of the influential political pamphlets in 1774 against colonial taxation without colonial representation in Parliament. He served in the Continental Congress. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. He's usually most credited with the structure of Article II, creating the presidency. He played a major role in the Pennsylvania ratification debates. He served as an associate justice on the first Supreme Court, and he was one of only 6 men to sign both the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. He had a good resume. In 1789, George Washington appointed him to the court, and then in 1790, while he was on the Supreme Court, the trustees at the College of Philadelphia appointed him as their first professor of law. One of the contemporaneous newspaper accounts of his first lecture when he was a professor at the College of Philadelphia noted that in attendance were George and Martha Washington, John Adams, both houses of Congress, both houses of the state legislature, and a number of ladies and gentlemen. For Wilson, as he was giving this and preparing his series of lectures, he hoped that they would be for American law, and he understood law very broadly, American constitutionalism, American politics, that it would be something like what Blackstone's commentaries had been for a generation of colonial lawyers. Now, that ultimately didn't happen for Wilson. He died of malaria in 1797. At that time, he had lost money in land speculation. He spent time in debtor's prison while he was on the Supreme Court, and he lived out his remaining days continually evading creditors. And so his lectures were never published in his lifetime. And there's a Broadway musical waiting to be written about Wilson's life. And I think, like Hamilton, we could ask who lives and who dies and who tells your story. And scholars are starting to tell Wilson's story now in full and are interested in the ideas that he had, and particularly his lectures on law. And those lectures that Wilson gave show a deep appreciation for the role of education, and in this context, it's higher education, for sustaining the new republic. In his inaugural lecture, Wilson made 2 claims that are relevant for our conversation today, and I think could help guide our conversation next. The first claim was, quote, that law and liberty cannot become the object of our love unless they first become the object of our knowledge. And second, he said of these 2 things, law and liberty, that they, quote, should in some measure and in some degree be the study of every free citizen and every free man. Every free citizen has duties to perform, he said, and rights to claim. Unless in some measure and in some degree he knows those duties and those rights, he can never act a just and independent part. Now, it wasn't until 1885 that Henry Randall Waite coined the term civics to describe the study of the rights and duties of citizenship, but this idea of having a role for higher education in sustaining the republic goes back to the very beginning of the American experiment. As George Thomas has written a book about and talked about earlier today, some of the founders, even before ratification of the Constitution, were already advocating for the creation of a national university to educate the republic's future leaders and to unite people from different parts of the country. George Washington took up this idea in his inaugural message to Congress. In a republic, he said, what species of knowledge can be equally important and what duty more pressing on its legislature than to patronize a plan for communicating it to those who are to be the future guardians of the liberties of the country? Among others of the founding generation, some took up the idea of a public university at the state level. Many of their mottos of these public state universities reflect a core civic mission built into the very foundations of the university. And this is true for the University of Texas at Austin, which is chartered much earlier but opens in the 1880s at the same time that Americans after the Civil War are talking about civics as a new discipline of study. And the reason they're talking about civics, combining this Latin word for citizen and a Greek suffix for field of study and creating a new idea, is because they're deeply concerned about how to sustain the new birth of freedom after the Civil War. There's a reason why this is happening in that post-war period. And at the University of Texas at Austin, our motto, with apologies to Jed if he's here for my Latin, is Disciplina Praesidium Civitatis. Study is the guardian of the city. It's a loose translation of a line from Mirabeau Lamar's first message to the Texas Congress in 1838, where he said that cultivated mind is the guardian genius of democracy. And Lamar went on to ask, in a way that echoed George Washington, how shall we protect our rights if we do not comprehend them? And how can we comprehend them unless we acquire a knowledge of the past and present condition of things and practice the habit of enlightened reflection? William Battle was a classical scholar, former UT president, and he was tasked with designing the seal of the University of Texas in the early part of the 20th century. And he put the motto, that Latin motto, against a blue background, and that, he said, was to emphasize sincerity and truth-seeking in the academic mission. And then the seal has an open book in one of the top fields of this heraldic shield that symbolizes study of the past, its accumulated wisdom and lessons. And that is, for Battle, the discipline that's necessary to sustain free and flourishing societies in the future. The wreath and the seal then mirror the state of Texas, the political community for which the university exists. And after designing this seal for the flagship public university in Texas, Battle said that the motto incorporated in the seal was, quote, at once a justification of the university's existence and an ideal of its future. And so a question, reflecting back on this, is how do we carry out this task in the 21st century? And this is the central question, I think, for all of us today that we're thinking through. What do we envision for these new institutes, these new schools? How do we carry this forward? And to answer that, I think we should reflect on our moment and our opportunity. And so for our moment, I think we should face it head on. Confidence in higher education is at historic lows. Gallup poll last summer showed that 36% of respondents expressed high level of confidence in higher education. It was down 20% since 2015. Among Republican respondents, the percentage was 19%, and that's all prior to October 7th and the scrutiny that higher education has received since then in the spring of protests that we just had. I think that number is arguably lower and still declining. Some of this dissatisfaction, though not all of it, but some of it is related to the perception that higher education has become an ideological monoculture, closed to the full range of reasonable perspectives that are represented in our pluralistic society. Whether or not you think that's true, that perception poses a challenge for those of us who love the university and want to see it thrive. And a big part of that perception stems from the steady loss of conservative voices in higher education over time. John Shields wrote an article for National Affairs a while back called The Disappearing Conservative Professor, and his research with Josh Dunn found that conservatives make up only 4% of historians, 3% of sociologists, and 2% of literature professors. In many departments, that effectively means that there are none. And this disconnect between the public and the university, particularly in a place like Texas, where we are a red state in a center-right country with a very blue faculty on campus, that disconnect has not been good for either one. And at the same time, these academic disciplines, while they've become more ideologically homogenous, have also become more and more specialized. This is not necessarily bad, this kind of specialization. Many of the disciplines have sophisticated methods. The body of knowledge is deeper. The questions they ask are more sophisticated. But as we've done this, we've exchanged breadth for depth, and part of what once constituted a broad civic education have been separated from each other into different disciplinary units, or they've just dropped out altogether, and not always for nefarious motives. There's just no one asking these questions and doing this work anymore. And this creates space, I think, arguably, for new interdisciplinary academic units that focus on the core competence of the citizen and the core tasks of civic education. And this is what our system board of regents asked our campus to do when they adopted a resolution last year directing our president to take steps to implement a new school of civic leadership. The resolution that our regents adopted calls for, quote, a comprehensive interdisciplinary program of research, teaching, training, and equipping students in the knowledge and the aptitudes necessary to lead a free society. And it goes on to say that the school would do this by providing, quote, students with foundational knowledge and critical thinking skills, whatever we think critical thinking skills might mean, steeped in the Western tradition and American constitutional history, and educating students in the values and principles of a free society while equipping them to be the next generation of leadership for our state and nation. Now, this work, coming back to the perception on campus, this work is attractive to conservatives, but not only conservatives. And it's only conservative in the small c sense of the word. It's aimed at conserving what is best and worth preserving in our political institutions and imparting foundational knowledge to our students so that they can take responsibility for their world. They can steward and improve those institutions for the next generation. But the work isn't and ought not to be partisan. Partisan fights are too ephemeral. Political wins are too unpredictable for any institution which seeks to last to tie itself to a partisan mast. We live in a polarized time, but civic education must transcend that polarization, not by being moderate or value-free, but by being something else altogether. And for lack of a better word, I've started calling this pre-partisan. Before our partisan disagreements, we must be united by something, some common object of our love. This is an Augustinian insight. Augustine thinks about Commonwealth being united by a common object of love, and this is something that James Wilson picked up on in his first lecture on law. If law and liberty be the objects of our love, they must first be objects of our knowledge. And love in this formulation, in the classical formulation, is to will the good of the other. And so if we're to will the good of our political community, we must first know something about it and its underlying principles and its history and how it came to be. Not to tear it down or deconstruct it, but to make it better. That it can be made better presumes that it's open to critique. Civic education, like liberal education, must be committed to open inquiry, freedom of thought and speech, civil discourse, all in the pursuit of truth. There are no prescribed orthodoxies. And not because we're neutral on the question of truth, it's because we actually have put a stake in the ground on that question that these norms flow. Dorothy Sayers wrote in an essay that many of you are probably familiar with in the middle of the 20th century about the lost tools of learning. Here she was talking about the classical trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, which she described for the purpose of her essay as tools that we could take to study all sorts of different subjects, something that would continue long after formal education. And she concluded that the primary end, the purpose of education, would be to teach students how to think, not what to think, which you see at Ashland University all over on their banners. And so it is, I think, with civic education. We can turn to models of the past to think about the foundations of our civic life and to learn how to think about the foundations of our civic life and how to think about the responsibilities that fall on us as citizens. But on the details, we'll disagree. That's a sign that we're free and that we're thinking independently. And that must be true of these new schools and institutes of civic thought. So that's our moment. What of our opportunity? We've been given an opportunity and I think have a responsibility now to build these schools and these institutes in a way that will be meaningful and lasting, that we'll be able to look back in 20, 25 years and longer and see this moment as a moment that was significant for higher education. And of course, this isn't happening in a vacuum. We're all here together to talk about various projects around the country. Public universities in particular have been busy on this front. We've got new schools and institutes of civic thought in various stages of development in Arizona, Florida, Tennessee, North Carolina, Utah, and Ohio, and soon elsewhere, I would think. And so I'll leave us just with 4 broad thoughts about what success needs or requires in this moment, and we could think through some of the details about that. But the 4 major elements of success right now, the first is that we need to build within the university structures and according to its norms and procedures. We want to be part of the university when we build within it. The second is that we have to hire scholars who are distinguished for their academic excellence. We don't want to be the academic JV on campus. We want to have serious scholars doing serious work, including on the research front. And we want people also, though, who are not just researchers. They have to be committed to teaching, committed to mentorship, have an entrepreneurial energy and a desire to build. This isn't a conventional academic project, and so you need people who want to get to work. The third is that we collectively, we nationally need to develop innovative curricula that offer something unique and distinctive to students and their families who are coming to the university, and that connects with each other around the country. I think it's important for us to have cross-institutionally recognized programs of study where we understand that we're all part of the same intellectual project in one way or another. And we've seen over history these kinds of things do develop in higher education. There's a history to every discipline, and we're beginning to see the history of this new approach to civic education. Fourth is that we must build relationships on and off campus with as many people as we can. Some in the past have expressed to me, every once in a while somebody expresses the worry that these will become silos on campus. And my response is always, I sure hope not, and it won't be on our account if they do. We want to engage with everyone on campus. And I think we'll best serve the university and best serve the state if we do that. Now, we're all here today because we've made civic education part of our vocation. It's what we devote our lives to doing, teaching and research in these areas. But as James Wilson reflected in his inaugural lecture at the College of Philadelphia, these things are the proper province of every citizen. These ideas are part of our civilizational heritage, and it will be necessary for our students to wrestle with them, whatever walk of life they go in and whatever vocation they pick up, if they're to steward this fragile enterprise of constitutional self-government into the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for really rich discussions that give us a lot to talk about. I'm tempted to just start by asking you to respond to one another, because I do think that there is a difference of opinion here about maybe the very subject of inquiry. There's a sense, I think, in your approach, Peter, that civics is something like the study of how people can live in society with one another. And as you say, how can we get to a point where we can act together? And in your view of this, Justin, there's a sense that the purpose of civics, at least to begin with, is to familiarize the student with his or her own tradition and starting point. These seem like very different things. Are they very different things? And how do you, Peter, think about what Justin lays out as what it is that civics teaches?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. I'm tempted to, just because I really like what Justin's doing, would like to even be part of it, would like it to be also at Tufts. So I'm tempted to just smooth over the differences, but I think it's actually more interesting to create a contrast. So, so it's not an argument, but it is a contrast. So yes, I mean, I think that in my mind, the American Republic, its form and its history and the traditions in it do fit into the larger picture, because that's one of the we's that I, for example, am part of, and it's important to me. And because there's much to think about, and also because it's a rich tradition that tells us a lot about the more generic issues. For example, the Federalist Papers are a great textbook, especially, say, Federalist 10, a great textbook about how do you form groups in general, so quite applicable in other places. But to me, it's just a puzzle piece, and not the puzzle. I think it's I was involved in, Danielle Allen mentioned the American Educating for American Democracy project. That is actually defined as a project about American history and civics. I think that's completely appropriate, because it's partly because it was advice to 50 U.S. states for the kind of programs they should require in public schools, and that probably the puzzle piece of the American Republic should be pretty big in a K-12 American curriculum. But I'm very interested, for example, in Ukraine. I've been, done 5 intense institutes there. It's not the right puzzle piece for Ukraine. And I don't think, and so this is a bit situational. For example, it's interesting question how much how big that piece of the puzzle should be at Tufts. We do have something like 20% of our students are not U.S. citizens and are likely to go back to the other countries. A lot of our U.S. citizen students are very interested in the rest of the world. So I'm not sure, but one could make an argument that it should be a bigger piece of our curriculum than it is. But just conceptually, I would take the American Republic as a super important example that's particularly important for those of us who are Americans. But not sort of the basic question. But and then I'll shut up. Except I think that does get into interesting, deeper questions about how you think about traditions, which has been talked about all day. I didn't use the word. I actually do value traditions a lot, but I suppose to make a sharper contrast, I am talking about a sort of an analytic approach in which one takes on. So last thought is I'm interested in a curriculum in which certain kinds of questions are treated as fairly generic and universal to the human condition. So how do you form groups? How do you get people to collaborate? So for example, game theory is a fairly significant part of our curriculum. So game theory plays it. You can even look at Plato as an early game theorist. There's ways in which there's a tradition there, but it's a very different mindset. It's more, there's a bigger dose of the social sciences, and there's a bigger sense of maybe a cumulative research enterprise here about trying to figure out how to solve problems of human coordination. And that is different from a curriculum that's based on a bunch of great books and dialogue with each other.
Do you think of what Justin is describing as a part of that, or is it the other way around?
Well, it could be that each could be part of the other in a world that should be appropriately complicated. But from where I'm sitting, the American political philosophy tradition, with its antecedents and its connections, is part of it. It's just part of it. And I'm not sure how big a part it should be.
Justin, how do you think about this tension?
Yeah, I wonder how much of it is the focus on the particular versus the universal. The definition, which I was surprised to find out, I had mentioned that civics as a term originates in the 1880s. I assumed it was an older term. Of course, civic is something that we know, but civics as a field of study is new and it's American. And the definition is the study of the rights and duties of citizenship. And so that gets you into the question of, well, what does it mean to be a citizen? And a citizen of what commonwealth? And then you get into that question of the regime. And so I think in order to ask what it means to be a citizen, you have to know something about the regime that you're a part of. And then you get into the history and the principles of that regime. And the question about what it means to be a good citizen versus a good man is an ancient question, but it then requires you to think about citizenship in light of a universal understanding of what it means to be a good person. And so you're measuring, there's a critical aspect of that, thinking about to what extent you can be a good person in this regime as a good citizen. That's not going to be true of every regime. And so I think it's, in some ways, maybe it's the entry point looks very different. And so the entry point becomes our history, our tradition, the story of America. But that can take you in all sorts of different places. That could take you into the past, because you have to know about the antecedents of America. And so studying classical history and classical philosophy on through the modern era into the American founding, I think is a legitimate part of that. But then if you take the line forward, I think then you also get into questions about America's relationship to the world. And you've got to think about a global context of the American founding and of American history over time. So there's a way in which all these subjects get pulled in, but the emphasis often is more particular than it is general. But there's a way that I think our project then weds civics and leadership in a way that a lot of these institutes and schools are now putting those two things together. And I think the leadership component of it actually brings in some of what you're doing. And so if you want, if the question that you begin with is, what kind of education do we want leaders to have, which is different than what does it look like to study leadership. But if you're asking about the education they should have, at least some part of that education is going to be thinking through questions on the dimension that you're talking about that won't necessarily just be specific historical case studies, but will be actual applied research and social science methods and thinking through all those questions. So I think there's a place for all of it, but in some ways, maybe the tension is both in the order, what are you exposed to first and how do you go from there? And then also the relative priority of one thing over another.
Peter, it seems like maybe another tension is the centrality of the nation state.
Right.
I gather from Justin's description that while he would think about other communities, other levels, a city, a state, there's such a thing as an American city that's distinct for being an American city. And that means that in order to understand collective action in our particular society, you actually have to study the regime, as he puts it.
Yeah.
Is that seems not to be part of how you're describing what you do.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good contrast that everybody can place themselves on the spectrum. I mean, that's right. I think there's a bunch of powerful thinkers who think of the regime, and Montesquieu and many others who think of the regime as the primary or a major unit of analysis. And one of the authors of the original manifesto for civic studies was Eleanor Ostrom, who's a huge influence on me. And she didn't believe in that really at all, I think. Just to state her view a little more strongly than she might, she just thought that there was no such thing as the state. The world is extremely polycentric. There's many different levels and structures of organization from the micro to the macro, and they overlap. And so there isn't really a regime. Yes, there's a city, and the city's embedded in a state and in a country, and that's interesting. But there's also a way in which New York City is a Caribbean city in the present moment in really important ways, I think, right? And so things are connected to each other in all different ways. And so we're not embedded in a regime. We're embedded in a whole bunch of different circles around ourselves. I still think you study the American regime for sure, and I'd even require it. But again, to me, it becomes an example, and you immediately start questioning whether it's the thing. Well, for example, one of the questions, and it's a really good question, is to what extent is it continuous over the 250 years? Because it sure looks different, and not just because of changes in the Constitution or politics, but little things like the Industrial Revolution and the internet and things. I mean, is it the same regime? And that becomes a question. But if you're starting with Eleanor Ostrom, you don't really think it's going to be one regime. It's not. It's going to surprise you to learn that it has one continuity is going to surprise you. Yeah.
Is there knowledge that is required for this kind of civics? Knowledge of your own tradition, knowledge of your. Justin talks about an object of love, united by an object of love that we have to know before we can really belong to. Are you assuming a we that maybe actually needs to be inculcated before it's really there?
Right. So, well, there's a very good question about whether piety or loyalty needs to also be inculcated, and if so, to what. I accept that. Though I would kind of hope that would happen earlier, and that by the time you're in college, you're stepping a little aside from that. But is there knowledge? Absolutely, of all kinds. I mean, the diagram I showed, I don't know if you remember this, was a bunch of questions. To me, those are lifelong learning questions, and they're also research. This is also a map of a research agenda. So how do you create trust inside of organizations? That is, first of all, that has been studied, right? Social capital, these questions, there's a huge literature. But also, it's not going to be resolved permanently because it changes when we move from Web 2.0 to Web 1.0 to Web 2.0, and then when the social media collapses, and I mean, the world changes, and so the agenda changes. What you need to learn is whatever we know at the present moment about how to solve those problems that are on my list, plus the skills, and I'm talking about intellectual skills here for figuring out how to solve them in the future. But I would put some things that probably most people in the room wouldn't be so interested in on the list. So for example, game theory, because of the way that it generalizes across different scales and contexts of competition and collaboration among human beings.
Justin, in your view of this, there's a big we right at the center that needs to be known, and you emphasize knowledge in what you describe here for us. Is there a way in which that we and that knowledge can obstruct our understanding, our vision? Is it, at the end of the day, are we really studying this thing we've inherited so that we know it, or is this a path toward something more like liberal education, towards some set of questions? How oppressive are you letting that tradition really be in the sort of study you describe?
It's a good question that we've talked about. Several people have drawn that contrast between liberal education and civic education, whether there's a tension there. I do think that on the knowledge aspect, as we've thought through what a curriculum would look like for our students, we do want there to be a body of knowledge that the students are introduced to, and that anybody who goes through a course of study on civics would be able to say that they had been exposed to some core elements of what we think would constitute that body of knowledge. And so at a very basic level, if you go through a course of study on civics, you have a bachelor's degree from that. and you're at a job interview and they ask you about something about the Constitution, you should be able to say you've read it, you've thought about it, you've put some time into that. You know something about U.S. constitutional history, you know about the American economic system, you know about the various arguments for and against different economic forms. All of those kinds of things we hope would be part of a broad civic education. Does it also become a vehicle for thinking about broader, more universal questions? I think it does, and so to that extent, it also gets you into a liberal education. Even thinking about that course of study I had mentioned where reading foundational documents, those documents put people in argument with each other, and so it's a way of introducing people to argument. It's not that everybody in the past was right, because they couldn't have all been right, they all disagreed with each other, but you're being introduced to the arguments that they had, and then you're seeing the reasons that they gave for the positions that they had, and so it becomes a kind of liberal education by proxy, where you're being introduced to all the things that they're thinking about, and those questions end up being pretty weighty questions. You know, when you're reading the Lincoln-Douglas debates, those are big, universal questions that are embedded within a very particular historical moment, and so I think it does get you into that. The other aspect of a liberal education is the part about leadership. So what kind of education do we want future leaders to have? And a liberal education done well is an education that's appropriate to free people. And so the idea is that it prepares you for freedom, and it's worthy of your freedom. This is the kind of study that free people would engage in, and it also prepares them for a kind of intellectual freedom and for self-government. And so to that extent, I don't think civic education and liberal education are at odds or are necessarily at odds. Now, civic education in a different regime might be quite at odds with liberal education, but I don't think it is in the US.
I wonder if we can think about this moment in relation to that challenge, that tension between liberal education and civic education. Liberal education liberates the student from what is oppressing the student. And there are certainly times when what oppresses the student is an overbearing presence of what is his own. Too much knowledge of your own city is more or less what Socrates was liberating some of his students from. They were really Athenian, and they needed to see through some things. Peter, do you worry that today's students are really not overly American when they come to you and they need to be liberated into a kind of universal understanding, but that maybe they, and Justin, I wonder if this is part of what you're doing or not, they need to be liberated from a set of shared notions that are not familiar enough with the American tradition, and that to inform them about it is the beginning of a liberation. Is civic education an opening to liberal education for you too, Peter, in this sense?
I think probably students don't know as much as they should know about, even our students are really talented. And by the way, they're 18 years old, so it's always worth remembering 5 years ago they were not even teenagers. Right. How much have you all learned in the last 5 years? I mean, I've learned some stuff, but I haven't learned that much. I'm just trying to say that to ask an 18-year-old to know everything is not fair, and they're on a quick upward trajectory. But I think they probably don't know as much about the U.S. System as they should, and I think they maybe are on the whole too critical of it and not appreciative of it enough. Although I think that's a little bit of a stereotype, and I find many students have all kinds of complex views. So I'm in favor of more of that, more study of the American system, even for those students who are just visiting for 4 years and then going back to other countries. I think I do like the idea of freedom, obviously, and liberty. I think one piece of freedom, of course, is not the freedom of the complete individual against the society, but rather the collective freedom of people, but also in associative groups. So it's the freedom to associate and then to do things collectively, and that's a kind of freedom that, that's the Tocquevillian freedom. That's the kind of freedom that, and it also could be, as I just did by referring to Tocqueville, parsed out in an American way, but it's also a global thing, and that's the kind of freedom that's always at risk. At risk both from oppression from the top, but also from the failure to be able to coordinate behavior so that you can do something collectively together. So if we imagine freedom as just non-restraint, then, well, that's not what I'm interested in.
Yeah. Justin, is what you're offering for everybody? Is it even for foreign students? Peter mentioned foreign students, and you can see how what he's doing would be as natural a fit for them. do you think this is something that everyone who comes into the University of Texas at Austin should be exposed to?
I would hope so, yes. I get that question about foreign students. To what extent is this just going to be about America, and do foreign students want to take that? I do think it's an important thing for us to offer as a state university. We have a certain obligation to the citizens of our state, and we are first and foremost training. We're supported by the state legislature, supporting the education of students who will become leaders in those communities around. But we have a lot of foreign students. And I think that they would benefit from studying civics in the American context, partly because it gives them a broader appreciation for the United States and everything that can be gleaned from that, but also because it does get you into those questions that are perennial. And so you have a particular context for a question, how it was sorted out in the US, but you can apply that to a different context. And so I think that comparative aspect of it's helpful. Actually, I have a Chinese student who was in my US constitutional law class, who loved it and came to me recently and asked for a summer reading list and it's anything you want me to read, just let me know. What should I put on my summer reading list? So it's an interesting question, actually. I have to, very practical right now. I have to think about what would be the right kind of reading list for a student like that would be beneficial.
I do want to open things up, think about what questions you have. Before we do that, one more question for you from me. Is what you're doing a critique of the existing disciplines? What's the relationship of this kind of civics education in the university to the history department, the political science department?
Yeah, I think our existence is in a way an implicit critique of the status quo. You're making the argument that there's something that's needed, and by saying there's something that's needed, there's something that's lacking. So what is lacking exactly? And I think that we could answer that in multiple ways. One thing that I had mentioned earlier is just the specialization of the disciplines, that they've gone in different directions, but what constitutes a broad civic education has not been fully consumed within any one department, and certain aspects of it have dropped out. And so as an example, many political science departments are heavily quantitative in orientation, and they have not asked some of these core questions like I'm talking about. The class that I took, that I began with, probably won't be taught in the future as new faculty come online and new research interests take over what's being taught. That's not necessarily a criticism of what's being taught, it's just saying that something is being left out. In economic history, as another example, you don't have a lot of people doing economic history in econ departments. You don't have a lot of people doing econ history in history departments. You don't have anybody doing economic thought in political science departments. So there are whole aspects of what would constitute a good civic education that just aren't being taught. And if they are being taught, they're isolated in different places around the university. So I think the promise of a new interdisciplinary unit is bringing those pieces together. Now there's also the component that I talked about before, which is the perception and the reality of a kind of ideological monoculture in the university. And one promise of these new schools and institutes is that you can help remedy that in certain ways, partly because the kinds of classes that we're talking about and the kinds of subjects that would be taught are going to be attractive to right-of-center students and faculty, not exclusively, and it does not need to be a right-wing version of the left-wing thing that it's reacting against. I think that's a bad idea for it to be that. But it is going to have a kind of intellectual diversity, both within institutes and schools and for the university as a whole, and I think that's going to be a helpful thing for the broader conversation.
Peter, you showed us how what you're doing is distinct from the other disciplines. Do you worry about this intellectual diversity problem too? Is that part of what you're responding to also?
Yes, I just agree. Actually, I just agree with everything Justin said. I mean, the only thing I would add is that the fact-value distinction in its crude forms is another part of the problem, because the citizen, as I've described a citizen, is not distinguishing between facts and values. The two things are very closely intertwined. You're trying to figure out what should we do. You're talking about facts and values together, but we've sort of pretended that we farmed out values to philosophy and maybe political theory, maybe religion, and the social sciences are going to be value-free, and then most people in this room would think they're not. So that's just problematic, and so the space we should be occupying is a space where fact and value are very closely related.
Let's take some questions.
Thank you very much. Luke Foster, I'm a postdoc at Notre Dame. A question about the regime, which has been, I think, implicit in both of what you've said, and in some ways has been been coming up all day. What about the tension between the aristocratic and democratic aspects of civic education? Right? And I think there are layers to this tension. One of them is rhetorical, right? We don't, as Americans, we instinctively don't like to sound aristocratic or exclusive. But at the same time, if we want to explain to parents of potential students why they should send their children to study with us, we have to be making the case that we're doing something different than elementary school social studies classes or even high school civics, right? We're preparing leaders, people who will have an education that not everyone will have, and there's presumably some value added there. So how do you think about that conceptually, and then each of you, and then how do you think about framing that in terms of making the case for your programs, the relationship between the hierarchical and the egalitarian aspect?
I mean, one quick thought is you take a place like Tufts, on one hand, pretty lefty and everything. On the other hand, a huge proportion of the students are going into finance and consulting. I think it's the third or fifth richest student body in the country. So despite whatever you might think about ideology in the classroom, it's actually a channel into finance and business. Only 7% of our students are actually going to anything related to politics or government or law immediately after graduation. I think a few more will go to law school, but most of them will be corporate lawyers. So there's a unexamined sense in which we are producing an aristocracy. We're also enrolling in aristocracy, predominantly. And then, so the sort of rhetoric then of equality and diversity and democracy is in a funny tension with the actual function of the institution, which a lot of students are sort of aware of and will even find an interest in talking about, but aren't really embodying that, and aren't really working through that contradiction. So then what we are actually offering is a civic education with a lot of little d democracy in it for a bunch of people who are actually going to be running powerful economic institutions in New York City or Boston, right? So that's an irony.
C.S. Lewis has a great short essay called Democratic Education, where he thinks through that question and makes the case that the kind of education small d Democrats want is not the kind of education that sustains democracy. And so it was an argument against democratizing educational standards, that you actually should be hierarchical in terms of the kind of education that you offer, and you want some people at the top to have a pretty high-level education. And I think we're already doing that with our university system. And so a place like UT Austin, it's a public university. We have 40,000 undergraduate students. The top 6% of graduating classes get automatic admission to the university. And so we're enrolling 40,000 valedictorians, and it's high level, but it's elite education at scale, but we've got a lot of really talented students there. And part of our premise is that those students just will be leaders in their communities in the future. And so it's not a question of whether they'll be leaders or not, it's a question of what kind of education do you want them to have while they're there. We did propose our degree as an honors degree, partly for this reason. We recognize it's going to be attractive as a major to a certain subset of the students, and so we want to recognize that group, and I think some of the students who come in will be highly motivated, interested in doing this at a high level, will require a lot of them, and so we'll pitch that as an honors major. I think that also addresses the question, to the extent that people are thinking about it, about whether this is something they should have gotten in K-12. And for our students, I've discovered that if you ask them that, they actually don't know about civics. They didn't take it. And so they don't have that association in their minds of civics as remedial. But I think some of the other people that you think, well, shouldn't you have had civics? Mm-hmm. But there's an answer to that, and that is, if it's worth teaching at the K-12 level, then it's worth having serious people doing serious work on it at the higher education level. And there's no other subject that we're teaching in K-12 that we would think, we don't need to bother with that subject at higher education because it's somehow beneath us. And so with civics, I think it's the same thing, that part of the history of this, if you go back to the word civics in the 1880s in the US, was focused on higher ed. And Joseph Wharton, when he gave his gift to create the Wharton School at Pennsylvania, thought in terms of civics. And he has a whole document about the kind of education business leaders should have, and it was all focused on civics. And so there's a way in which I think we can reclaim and recapture that word as something that is not a liability, but it's a real strength.
Can I just say one quick thing about, sorry to jump
Please,
in.
go
But just to build on what you said, one of the odd things that happens in K-12 is that K-12 schools actually do look to college disciplines for their guidance. So when they have a course that used to be called Civics, now they look to the political science department in colleges. So a lot of your students probably would answer that they had to take an American government. It's required in the state of Texas. But American government represents Poli-Sci 101 in college, and that has various limitations, even if that we've all talked about, right? Apart from anything else, it's strictly empirical value, allergic to talking about values, very quantitative, and that's actually what students are getting in a more demanding way than they got 30 years ago, but it's political science, it's not civics. Yeah.
In the back, please.
Hi, Flag Taylor, Skidmore College. This is a question to both of you. Just thinking about both the content of education and the kind of manners and mores of the citizen, do either of those demand kind of particular pedagogical approaches in the classroom?
I don't know that they do necessarily. I think there's a real value in having small courses, and there's something beneficial about a seminar setting where students can talk with each other. They can develop those kinds of virtues of civil discourse in that setting. But I also think that there's something that is valuable at having a large lecture class, that having students listen to and learn from a very good lecturer can be valuable. I think there are all sorts of different pedagogical techniques that could be brought to the subject matter. And so probably some mix of those different things would be beneficial. But at the end of the course of study, you do want students who have developed certain habits, aptitudes, and that's going to involve their ability to write, their ability to speak and to communicate. It gets us back into the question of the lost tools of learning, as Dorothy Sayer said. What are the tools that they pick up along the way? And I think we need to model our courses or design our courses so that they can inculcate those skills.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I would also distinguish between means and ends, and I don't really agree with the kind of people who say that a civic education has to be civic in the way that it's done, or that a democratic education has to be democratic. I think it depends on what works, and it's likely to be a mix. I do think that you made an earlier description in the Q&A of the seminar of the humanities classroom as a place where the texts are in dialogue with each other and are debated, and that is here. There's the question of the substance. What are the texts about? They might or might not be about anything civic. They might in fact be aesthetic or spiritual. There is probably something to be learned from the interaction about text with somebody who's different. What you're learning there is how to have interactions with people who disagree with you, and the text becomes an object for the benefit. Someone mentioned earlier today, it's good when the person who wrote it is dead, because it separates right.
Well, this is one of the reasons why I love teaching constitutional law, because it will get you into every controversial issue that we have in American politics, but in a really concrete way. It's not hypothetical, it's very specific. You have parties, you have facts of the case, and then you have students read both opinions. They have majority opinions, dissenting opinions. They have to talk about that. They have to put themselves inside those arguments. And so it just requires them to think about things in a different kind of way, rather than just, what do you think about X, Y, or Z? It's a very structured way to have to think through those dilemmas.
Another question.
We're not disagreeing very much. Maybe
I know. I'll try to get one.
Gin up some.
Please, over here.
Yeah.
Thank you. Amanda Green, UC Santa Barbara. So you've all started the panel by saying we're thinking about the relationship between civic education and the university. And I wanted to follow up by asking you to say a little bit about the concept of expertise, which I take to be constitutive of the university as an institution. So I was struck by, I think it was a quote from James Wilson, who said, citizenship is the particular province of every, no, what was the particular province of?
Every free man, every free citizen.
Every free citizen.
Yeah.
And it reminded me that there's a kind of everyman ethos in the study of civics. And there's a similarity with philosophy in that I tell my students, we're going to be asking questions that children ask and answering them in the way that lawyers answer them. But philosophy conceives of itself as continuous with everyman, with a kind of everyman ethos of inquiry. But that's not how it works in the university. It's institutionalized. There is such a thing as philosophical expertise. So how are you thinking about expertise in the case of civic education, and how would you say it's different from or similar to other academic fields of study?
I think the question connects to the conversation earlier about what it means to be a generalist versus a specialist. And so in some ways, it's the education of a generalist in the sense that a citizen has to be able to take on information that can be generated through expertise, but they have to be able to synthesize that information and to make judgment calls about how we live our day-to-day lives together that isn't itself any particular area of expertise. And so, for example, if you are trying to make decisions about, maybe you might have brought this up, Ben, the question of the pandemic, policymaking during the pandemic. If you rely on experts, they have an expertise, but it's in one area. And that one area, the knowledge that's gained from that one area might not be enough to make decisions taking in knowledge that's gained from every area. And so you're gonna have to synthesize that, but if you allow infectious disease experts to do public policy without any other information or taking on expertise from any other area, I think you're gonna have a nearsighted view of what ought to be done. So part of what you're doing is you're training students in the habit of thinking through big questions and synthesizing information that can be generated by experts, but you're not training them to be an expert in any particular area. And I think arguably that's the role of post-secondary education. When you go to graduate school, you can develop your expertise, but for the kind of training, the everyman training that you're talking about, really that has to begin before you get to the university and hopefully should be accomplished before you get to the university. So there is a deepening of your education at the higher education level, but if this is the province of every free citizen, every free man in the community, that's got to take place earlier. And so I think this is, Danielle Allen earlier had made the comment about one of the things universities can do is educate the people who will be going out into the K-12 world, because I think that one of the most important issues right now is what we're doing with K-12 education, and I think that's an area that we need to put some time and attention on.
Yeah, once again, just to build on it, not to disagree, it might be interesting to think about an analogy to professional education. For example, a classic profession like medicine. So the future physician is taught a lot of information, skills, concepts, ethics as well, medical ethics, and a kind of way of being by people who are part of the medical profession, but who are much more specialized, right? So you're going to be taught biochem by perhaps an MD, PhD, who's a biochemist. So, and then you might specialize as a physician, or you might be a general practitioner, but you go through a point at which you're a doctor, and that's what you are. So but the limits, of course, of that is that it's assumed that you're going to be a doctor. So what if we step back from that and ask what's a vocational education for a citizen? I think it's somewhat similar. It's trying to get you to the point where you're the general practitioner of citizenship. Some of the people in that discussion are actually much more expert, including the faculty who teach the specific things. So you don't want to study, James Wilson from somebody who doesn't know about it. You want to study about it from somebody who does know about it. You might want to go off and be an expert on James Wilson, or you might want to be a civil society leader, not necessarily an academic. You might want to specialize. And so what I'm trying to say is expertise is part of it, and even very advanced expertise. If I want to know about how to create trusts and groups, I want to know what social psychologists say, and that's part of it. But the point is not to produce a whole bunch of specialists. The point is to produce the general practitioner of the art of citizenship, and that's a kind of model for what we might think of as then the liberal arts.
Let's take one more question in the back here. Yeah.
Michael Promisel, Catholic University of America. Justin, like you, my life was transformed by a class in American political thought. That class was sponsored by none other than Jim Caesar. So I'm going to bring up my favorite book by Jim as a vehicle for my question. In Liberal Democracy and Political Science, Jim argues that traditional political science was aimed at the statesman. The traditional role of political science is to cultivate the habits, the skills, and the knowledge that are necessary to govern the common. Modern political science is actually the aberration in this great history. So is the modern moment an opportunity for the revival of a sort of long-standing tradition rather than the invention of a new discipline? Thank you.
When I was first hired in a faculty role after graduate school, I had a reception where an emeritus professor was attending, and he asked what I studied, and I told him what I was doing, and he said, throwback. And I didn't know I was a throwback until that moment. Yeah, I do think there's something about that. The first School of Political Science at Columbia University, their founding document, says that the goal of political science as they create this school is to study politics from the threefold perspective of history, philosophy, and law. Mm-hmm. And so there's a built-in interdisciplinary aspect to what political science originally was about. And that was focused on training future leaders. And so that was the explicit goal of the School of Political Science at Columbia. That was the explicit goal when you look at the founding documents of University of Virginia, all of these different places. They were very self-consciously thinking about what kind of curriculum and what kind of education should our future leaders have. And the thing that was on the list, in UVA's case, they're a little biased toward the Virginia founders, but it was, you're going to read the Washington's farewell address, and you're going to read the Declaration of Independence, you're going to read the Constitution, the Federalist Papers. And so it's very similar, actually, the kind of curriculum that we have in mind to what they were doing in the past. And in that same era of the founding of the first School of Political Science is also when Americans are talking about civics as a serious thing that we need to be doing. And so I think there's a big element of coming back to or returning to a discipline that was already there and recovering it. And part of the story of this is not just political science. I think the history, philosophy, law, we add economics and other social sciences, and for that matter, other humanities, that all of that becomes part of this discipline that we have in mind. But it is something, it's not really, we're not inventing something new. We're recovering something that's been there and trying to improve it for the future.
Yeah, I mean, right. And just briefly, I think, what if it's not education for statesmen, what is it? So one answer is, well, it's a science, meaning it's value neutral, it's descriptive, it's explaining what is happening. It's not actually asking the question, what should we do? And that's a primary rival, right? And a primary reason that, and there's a real suspicion of something that was about what should we do, as opposed to science, because it's seen then as being somehow value laden in a problematic way. Although I don't agree with that, because I believe in values, but also because I think values come back in the back door anyway. So positivism is one of the rivals. I guess the other conversation is about how many people can be statesmen. And one, actually, if you really take statesmen seriously, do we have any at the moment? Certainly we don't have very many, right? So, but the other, for what it's worth, my view would be kind of an Eleanor Ostrom view. She was a huge influence on me. Would be, yes, actually we have millions and millions, or at least thousands and thousands of statesmen. It's just that the scale of leadership is quite diverse. So, school board, city council, but not those are political, but also church. And so actually we are educating for statesmen, and we just think that most people can be statesmen.